Hello, everyone. Welcome to the StepZen stream. My name is Anthony Campolo, and today we have Paul Copplestone with us. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Anthony. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great to have you. You are the CEO of Supabase, which is a database hosting company that is an open source competitor to Firebase. And I'd be curious to get your kind of high level description of what Supabase is and a little bit of the history and how it was created.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, we're an open source Firebase alternative, which I guess makes us a competitor. Yeah, we are essentially building the features of Firebase, but we use open source tools, and we try to use existing open source tools rather than build from scratch. As an example, as we'll see today, we use Postgres as the database, just a raw Postgres database. We don't do any abstractions or anything like that. And then we're focused on a few key features of Firebase, the auth as well, the database, of course, the storage layer, so storing large files, and a few others like functions and a few others in the works right now. So yeah, it's largely just an open source sort of platform for using open source tools, but really our focus is on the developer experience. We think Firebase has an amazing developer experience, and we really wanted to bring that sort of experience to open source tooling.
Yeah, I really love that mission because I am also a big proponent of open source. I'm someone who came up in the open source world through Redwood. And that's actually how I first heard about Supabase is someone on the Redwood forums posted about Supabase and they're like, hey, this is a really easy way to get your Postgres database set up, which for us, we were already using Postgres a lot in our tutorials and our example projects and still using Heroku at the time. And Heroku is an amazing way to get a database spun up really quickly, but it doesn't really give you as much like low level access to it that you might want to like really start building stuff on top of it. And that's what I found with Supabase is that you give you this really nice, easy deployment and hosting experience, but then you also give you underlying access to the database itself. And you can basically do whatever you want with it, right?
Yeah, our design philosophy or our product philosophy is very sort of open source. The idea is that everything's decoupled and everything's integrated. So, you can use the database and we give you raw database access. You can use the auth, which integrates very nicely with the database and row level security and everything. You could use just the storage. So every sort of system is distinct, but they all center around the database itself. And then we give this Postgres level access. So you can use nothing but the database and plug in tools, as I'm sure we'll see today. You can plug them directly into the database. You can plug them into our auto-generated API, which we provide through PostgREST. Yeah, so it's really just about giving developers options if they want them, escape hatches, but we provide everything that we can if you want to just use our suite of tools directly.
Yeah, PostgREST with a T is especially going to be an interesting one because that's what we'll be kind of showing here. Because with StepZen, we have GraphQL directives that let us hook into different endpoints, whether that's a database or a REST endpoint or other GraphQL endpoints. You can essentially do any of them. So you can make DB queries like directly into Supabase, and we actually have a doc showing kind of how to do this, but we're going to do something slightly different today, which is use PostgREST. And so PostgREST, you're employing the maintainer of that now, right?
Yeah, correct. Actually, he was probably one of our first very early employees. So it was started by well, I actually only know his GitHub name, bgriffs, but a long time ago, I think 2015, it's written in Haskell. It's pretty cool. It sort of introspects your Postgres database and produces a very, very flexible REST API, not just like GraphQL actually. And then from there, it yeah, sort of got momentum. It's very open source. I think bgriffs, well, he's dropped off now, and then there's another maintainer, Steve Chavez, who has been maintaining it for, I think, a couple of years now, and we employ him full time to work on PostgREST and of course Supabase, but yeah, most of his focus is on maintaining PostgREST.
Yeah, it's really cool that someone was able to one, take it over, and then two, so get funded to actually work on it because there's so many great open source projects that can just kind of stagnate or just go to the wayside because only one person was doing it, and then when that person leaves, no one else wants to do it. But there's like so many people who want to work on open source and so much value that these projects can provide that it's really good to see when they're able to work that out, so you can actually get that momentum going again. And did you reach out to them, and did they reach out to you? Like, how did that first happen?
Yeah, I think we got into Y Combinator in summer 20, and at that point, I believe that I emailed. So actually, I originally was in contact with them because I used it in my previous company. This is sort of the origin of Supabase. I built much of the stack, or I was using much of the stack in my previous company, and sort of ideating how we'd build Supabase. And in that one, he had picked up a blog post of mine where I explained exactly the structure. If you go and look at it, it looks very similar to Supabase architecture. And he had put it on the PostgREST docs. And so we were already in contact via email. And then after we got into YC, I think I reached out to him and said, hey, what are you doing? You're working full time. We'd love to support you.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super, super cool. Is there any other open source projects that you think you might be funding somewhere in the future, or you have a stable source now of kind of what you're doing?
Yeah, we've just hired someone to work on Postgres itself to contribute directly. That's sort of the goal. Then and of course, that's sort of run. I don't know if many people know how it's run, but it's a great project. It's sort of not owned by any company. There's a sort of committee or like a community of developers who do it, and they don't even allow one company to sort of own all the core team. It has to be spread across several companies. So yeah, Postgres, and then we have a lot of other tools. So we also use Netlify's GoTrue server for all our authentication, and well, we employ people internally to work full time on that. Yeah, there's a few tools, and probably we're looking at a couple more that we can hopefully bring into the fold, so to speak.
Nice. Yeah, it's really cool you're contributing to Postgres itself. Like, Postgres has to be one of the most successful open source projects just of all time. It's done very, very well and seems to only be getting more and more popular, and more people are using it.
Yeah, it's one of those amazing things where it's arguably one of the best. I mean, if you dig into it in terms of what it can do compared to some other databases, I mean, it's just one of the best databases. The fact that it's also open source and sort of belongs to no one is, just amazing. And really, that's the promise of open source, the original promise. And I think that's amazing. It would be great if the whole world operated like that, because then, well, we would have some very cool tooling.
Indeed, and we're getting into philosophy here. Yeah, I don't really know much about the start of Postgres, Sean. I'll have to look into that. That sounds interesting.
Sure, yeah. It's
All right.
it's pretty fascinating. Yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and start getting some stuff going. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here, and I've got a repo over here if anyone is interested. That is kind of what we're going to be going through and what we'll be doing here. And what's going to be happening is I'm going to start by creating a StepZen project, and then we'll create the Supabase project, and then we'll start actually like connecting the two together. So first things first is I've just got like a blank project here that I'm going to create some files in. These are what you need to just set up your StepZen project in general. And it's going to configure things like our endpoint and our keys and things like that. So this StepZen config is just going to set us to API /StepZen-Supabase will be our endpoint name. And then what's cool about StepZen is that it lets you take multiple different files and different schemas and then aggregate them all together into just like one big schema that you'll be using. So that's what this is. We have two files that will be combining author and book. So it's very simple little example here. And then the config.yaml is how we're going to actually authenticate, which we'll get into a little more once we actually get our Supabase keys. So let's actually get into the Supabase dashboard now. So the Supabase dashboard is something that you've put a lot of work into. I know you even work on it personally, like on streams and whatnot. And so how did the Supabase dashboard kind of first come to be, and what were your like goals with it in terms of like what you wanted it to be able to do?
Yeah, so originally we had this interface. Of course, Firebase is just very easy to use, right? So we knew that we had to have a dashboard for Postgres. There are plenty of tools to interact with Postgres, but you have to install them yourself, and you have to go through a process. So really, our first thing was we wanted to put Postgres in the hands of developers, but sort of as fast as possible. And so we created the dashboard where you could our metric was sort of time to query, where you could spin up a Postgres database and then immediately query your database. That was the goal.
Nice. Yeah, and it definitely does it pretty quickly. Let me actually take this. I don't need to do it off screen actually because you hide it. Yep. Oh, need a strong password. We'll actually just do this. So I'm gonna end up tearing this down. So it doesn't really matter too much, but just give you a little example project. So this is going to actually kick off our example. And how does this like where is it hosted? Like when you're actually spinning up a project?
Yeah, so you chose the region there in the US West. That is actually we put in brackets the AWS region. So all of our infra at the moment is set up in AWS. The goal is probably to just make it multi-cloud so you can deploy it anywhere. If you go to our repo, you can sort of self-host it. It's a Docker Compose file. So on the back end can be deployed to anywhere, any cloud basically. Yeah. And in the background now, this is spinning up the database, but then it's also spinning up an auth server. It's spinning up the RESTful API, an API gateway, storage server. It's spinning up basically 5 different tools for everyone. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's going to be very hard to figure out how to do something like this multi-cloud. So that sounds like that would be a really interesting technical challenge to figure out.
Yeah. It should be okay. I mean, at the moment, we don't have, we can make actually the spin up a lot faster if we're using Kubernetes. We're not using it, something like that. But for now, it's not in their architecture. But eventually, we'll probably move to something like we'll make a goal to make the project spin up immediate, in which case we'll containerize everything and make sure it's very fast.
Yeah, I've tried out a couple different services that kind of do this, and it does take a little bit longer on yours than some others, but it sounds like because like you're doing a whole bunch of stuff. Like you're not just getting a Postgres database. There's a lot of stuff that kind of goes along with it. Also gets spun up, and it's like you can chill out for like a minute or two, and like it's really not that big a deal, I think. But it is nice to have something to spin like 5 seconds. It's very good for like demos and things like that.
Yeah, it's not great for onboarding people, of course, but on the flip side, it's very hard to crash your database. so we went for scalability over immediate spin up. At the time as well, there weren't many people offering Postgres like immediate spin up, so we're still faster than say RDS or things like this. So it's fine.
Cool. And so you give a bunch of different ways to kind of access your database. So you have things like JWTs, you have connection string URL you can use. You also give like kind of keys that you could use. So we're going to be using the project, or good to go. We're going to be using the project API key here, and this is how we're going to authenticate our REST calls. And so this is where some of the StepZenisms come into play, where we create this config.yaml that has our API key that's set to this config, and then that's going to be put into our queries. And then we also have this endpoint here, so everyone gets their own kind of custom endpoint that they can access, and this is where the PostgREST comes into play. I'm just going to replace all of these because I've got couple examples here.
So just so I know, and maybe people watching, because I'm coming in fresh, this is a brand new project which will get deployed to like a cloud, right? Or
Yeah, so what's going to happen is that we're going to deploy a API gateway that is going to let us access this endpoint through a GraphQL interface.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet. So once you get your thing set up, then we want to create a table. Let me also grab this key here. Okay, so to create a table, you have a nice kind of table editor here, and it lets you really easily just create a table like so. So we're going to start with just an authors table, and you have a couple pre-made columns for things like ID, and then created at and updated at. And these get auto-generated if you don't kind of like give any input, which is really nice. So how do you think about like defaults and like how you set up defaults for like a table?
Yeah. So like this one, for example, you mean how should the user think about it, or how do we think about
Like what do you
presenting it?
recommend? Do you recommend that people kind of just stick with the defaults, or are there like kind of other things that you would recommend someone do? Like, and obviously it would depend on what kind of project you're building, but that's just like something I'm always kind of curious about, like how you set up a default like database table.
Yeah, as you can see, we sort of suggest doing an ID is always good. I put a single primary ID on everything. So
Mm-hmm,
you can do composite primary keys and things like this, especially on many-to-many tables. But I
mm-hmm,
still prefer to put a single ID. Wherever possible, I actually try to change it to if I think it's going to sort of in the future get sharded like across multiple servers, put a UUID from the start,
mm-hmm,
which is yeah, you know, the default for Postgres is like an identity field or a serial, which is a number. But you know, if you have multiple databases connected together, then the numbers incrementing can conflict. So yeah,
mm-hmm.
I think these are the two most useful ones. The other one there, I saw that you put text as the
Yeah.
column name.
Mm-hmm,
That's good because by default, it doesn't matter with if you come from some other databases, they might suggest using varchar or like a certain size. With Postgres, it doesn't actually matter whether it's text. You don't really have to choose too much. You might want to put a constraint on how long it can be, but in terms of storage size, you don't need to define how long the text is. So, yeah.
cool. Okay, and so I think if I did everything right, this curl request here is going to just show us like our just the fact that we like have an endpoint kind of set up. This obviously isn't very readable here, but what's going on there is it's showing us the Swagger implementation. So Swagger is open API, and this is how we kind of introspect our schema. So we're just going to like the / path and doing a get, and then runs introspection and then tells you like what you're kind of dealing with and what parameters you have and stuff like that. So that'll let you know that your database is set up and good to go. And then now we want to actually add some stuff to this database. So we want to create a row, and I'm just going to say person1. And then now we got that, we can do a GET request directly into this database. So what's nice about having PostgREST just built in is that you're already ready to go for like using curl, or if you want to use Insomnia or something like that. Do you have an API favorite tool that you use?
Yeah, I mean, I usually use Postman, but I did see that there's one built into like an extension for VS Code that I
Hmm,
wanted to check out. I forget the name of it, but it sort of looks like Postman. So
nice.
at some point, I'm going to check that one out.
Yeah, and so if we see here, we got this JSON array with just a single object in it
Mm.
here. So we know that our database is good to go. Our endpoint is all set up. We know how to authenticate with it. And what we can do now is we can actually get our StepZen project going. So first thing we'll do is we're going to create an author type. And so you create a type for your whatever like your tables are essentially. And so we have an author table with these 4 columns. So we turn them into GraphQL fields. We have an ID for the ID, string for the name, and then date time for created at. And then the query is where the interesting stuff is really happening, because we have the at-rest directive, and we're feeding it the endpoint, which is what we were looking at before. I need to get that correct endpoint here. And then we do the Supabase config, which is what connects your API key from the config.yaml. So this lets you then deploy this to, you could set this up on like a GitHub repo, and you just want to make sure you git ignore your config.yaml, which we've got here. And so then you don't get your keys to accidentally pushed up to a Git repo. So it's a really nice workflow and a good way to basically like GraphQLize your REST endpoint. And then once you got all that set up, we're gonna run StepZen start, and this will actually deploy our endpoint. And then once we have the endpoint deployed, we can run a sample query. So gonna run this author query here, and then we get back the thing we just created.
Oh, wow, cool.
Let's see, Sean's asking, love to see how one might implement the node interface both on Postgres side and StepZen side. So what do you mean by the node interface? Is that like the there's Postgres stats like JS and things like that, right? That's a question for you, Paul. Do you know, like, there's different client libraries for Postgres, or I think there's like PostgREST JS, or like, yeah.
Yeah, so these are ones that we provide. You can communicate with your RESTful API on Node itself. If he's talking about Node.js, then you can install this on the server, or you can install it on the client. If you install it on the server, we provide also a service key, which will bypass row level security. If you install it on the client, then you should always just provide the anon key.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay, so now that we've got the queries set up, we can also post to the database as well. So we have, let's see, let me go over here. This is the one thing that
asking about the GraphQL node interface, which actually
for StepZen, yeah. Let's see, so that's good. That's good. Okay, cool. Okay, so with so I'm also going to create a books endpoint. Let's see, where did the Supabase one? There we go. So now we have, each time you create a table, it just gives you an endpoint kind of automatically. So you can just create more endpoints, and this one's going to be the same as the other. And if we have more time, we would do like a key to like reference the authors to the books or something like that. But for right now, we're just going to kind of show how to actually get connected to the endpoints and read and write to them. So now we can actually post to this endpoint, and you still do the similar thing with the header and the URL, and then you also have to specify that you're sending a content type JSON, and then you have this little data thing that just sends the data in the body. And so let's try this here. And then if nothing happens, that's good, because it doesn't return anything on the post. So to actually see that it's working, you can then do another get on it here, and then you'll see the thing you just created, which is curl book test here. That was all good, Sean. I always enjoy people derailing streams. That's where the most interesting questions come into play usually. Exactly. Okay, sweet. So any questions from you, Paul, about kind of what just happened, or was that all fairly intuitive?
Well, intuitive for me. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a heavy GraphQL user, so some of it's sort of a bit new for me. But otherwise, I think it's quite cool. It's all connecting up. Yep.
Yeah, the way I think about it is like StepZen's like a universal query machine. You can kind of just figure out how to query anything, and then it makes the opinionated decision of you will query through GraphQL. So I'm someone who came up through Redwood, which is like a very GraphQL heavy project. So I'm a big fan of GraphQL. And I remember when I had you on my podcast back in like January, that was one of the things I asked you about. I was like, what's the GraphQL story with Supabase? And you're like, there really isn't a GraphQL story. And that's actually the right answer, because if you have a GraphQL story, usually it's not the GraphQL story half the GraphQL people actually want. But if you set up in a way where you can kind of create your own GraphQL story, that's a good way to go. So this is one way that you could GraphQLize this. If you wanted to, you could use like PostgreSQL, which is basically PostgREST, but it spins up a GraphQL endpoint. And like that's what I did with Railway when I had them on the stream. So it's a question of like, when do you want to translate something from a database to GraphQL, or from a REST endpoint to GraphQL, or from the database to GraphQL to then another GraphQL? There's like so many ways to do it.
Yeah.
Very
And it
interesting.
seems, I really like the idea of some sort of API aggregator where, everything gets thrown into a single interface for developers, especially. Like, you can come in and see all the different endpoints of all the different systems. I assume, for example, you might work with the Stripe endpoints and things like that, right? So, in which case, the developer experience around having a single repository for interacting with all your tools would be, really nice.
Yep. So now we're creating a similar schema to what we did before with the author. We have this book type now with an ID name, create at and update at. And then we have a query, which is essentially identical from the other query, and then the mutation. And so a mutation is just GraphQL speak for anything that's not reading. So if you're writing, if you're updating, or if you're deleting, those are all mutations. And then if you're just reading, then you're querying. And so the way we're doing, Alex, the way we're doing the mutation is somewhat similar in that we still have an endpoint and we still have the configuration for our API keys, but now we're specifically specifying that we're doing a post method, and then we include this post body, and then we're able to then use this .get to get the name argument. So with GraphQL, when you send queries or mutations, you can send arguments as well. So the argument is going to be a name. So we're just going to send a name, and then things like the ID and the create at and update at, that's going to be generated automatically by Supabase, which is really cool that it works out like that. Okay, so now that we got all that set up, that should be good. That should be good. Let's go back to this here. And so we're going to do a mutation, and this is a mutation that we defined, and then this is where the actual argument comes in. The name will be StepZen book test. And then because it doesn't return anything back, it just gives you kind of like a null object back. But if you actually do the query here, then you can get back all the data. So we see we have both the test that we did with curl, and then the mutation that we just ran with StepZen. And so that's pretty much how you would get reads, writes, everything kind of into the StepZen project.
Very cool.
Then updates would be the next thing to figure out. Cool.
So updates, I assume, would be the same, but you just attach a patch instead of a post.
Yeah, and then or a put, right? Because
put, yeah, we do.
So I guess it'd be if you're
Upsert.
updating the whole thing, it's a put, or if you're updating like a single part of it, then it's a patch. I think is the difference between the two.
Yeah, the other thing that we have is we have upserts. If you apply some headers, so it can be as long as you provide the IDs.
So what is an upsert? I'm not super familiar with that term.
So an upsert is either an insert or an update. So if you provide,
Mm,
for example, the ID, it'll update the column. If you don't provide an ID, then um, it'll insert a column. So you've got this single interface for doing new data or updated data. Quite convenient.
mhm.
Yeah, and then you've got some returning headers, so you can immediately return the data, and it'll return the ID of the newly created data.
Nice. Yeah. So how do you think about like what kind of stuff? Like, do you expose all of Postgres just kind of by default?
Yeah, we tried to. So yeah, Postgres was very mature before we came along. They had already created a lot of this stuff. So these libraries that we wrote to wrap it, just trying to expose everything that Postgres can do. There are a few configuration options that we don't expose yet, but we will eventually.
Mhm. Nice. Yeah, it's a really cool project, and it's a great way for people who may not be super savvy with databases to get spun up and start interacting with it immediately. Because it's almost like you have just a dedicated backend developer who just made an endpoint just for you, just for your database. And so it's a really cool. And then I'll be curious. I know that you just shipped functions not too long, or like the kind of first part of functions. So can you talk a little bit about like what exactly is going on with that and kind of where you're at with that?
Yeah, so functions is proving to be one of those ones. At our scale now, when people apply things, they we have to really consider scale. So functions is proving to be one of those ones that not just on a design point of view we want to make it very nice, but also on a scalability point of view we want it to be great. Uh, in my opinion, functions, there are already great options available, like AWS Lambda, or if you use Vercel or Netlify, they both provide functions. And so to start off with, we've provided these function hooks, as you can see. They're in very early stage alpha. The hooks essentially can attach to a table. So anytime there's an event on your table, an insert, an update, or a delete, then you can send that event to anywhere. At the moment, it's an HTTP endpoint, but eventually it'll be our own functions or a Lambda or Cloud Run. So yeah, immediately right now you could attach it to, attach it to say even probably a StepZen endpoint. So you could say anytime there's a change in this table, send an event to StepZen on this endpoint. We can show the interface if you want
Yeah, sure.
inside the dashboard.
Yeah. So let me get back to the dashboard here. So where am I going? Let me just go back into the project I just created.
Yep. And then if you go all the way down to the database level, we're hidden it away a bit because we, and then scroll down. Yeah, not production ready. So now you've got
Ah,
functions is actually Postgres functions, not
so it's more like a stored procedure, right?
exactly.
Mhm.
But if you go to function hooks, then this is the one. So you can just enable hooks now. All right. So you can create a function hook, and
Mhm.
here you just, for example, type a name. I think it might be better to underscore that rather
Underscore.
than,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Then you could say, on any author's insert or update or both. Then you scroll down and you just say that it's going to send an HTTP request to, and then you specify how and where you're going to send it to.
Hmm. Interesting.
And that's it. And it sends a payload, the full row of data. It'll send it to that endpoint, so you can then use that data to do whatever you want.
Okay, so
Okay.
this is not actually gonna like do anything, but I just kind of want to see what happens when you
Yeah.
kind of click confirm for it. Invalid input. Oh, um,
It might need HTTP
yeah.
or HTTPS. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're secure, that is.
Yeah.
Cool.
And that's it.
Yeah,
We
nice.
got Yeah. It's very limited functionality right now, but
Mhm.
there are people using it, which is great, and we love getting feedback in the widget up the top right. We get plenty of
Good.
feedback, which is always great.
Yeah, Supabase has been taking off like a rocket. It seems like you guys just had a very successful Series A, so congrats on that. You also
Thank
launched
you.
your Discord not too long ago, and it's funny because I was actually tweeting at you saying, "You guys, you really need a Discord." When you were in the process of already creating your Discord, you're like, "Yeah, yeah, we know."
Yeah, yeah. It's funny actually. There was a community one started already. So I mean, at that point, we either had to decide, well, do we just let the community completely do it? So all we did was convert the community one, the moderator of that, is a moderator on ours, and actually our Discord is largely community driven, and the community's been great. Yeah, really, it's a friendly Discord. There's plenty of activity there, so it's been really nice.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm such a huge fan of Discord.
Yeah.
I spend probably more time than I should on Discord, but it's just a really great platform for getting people like in a similar space to collaborate or to communicate because you can do chat, you can do actual like voice calls, you can just hop on a screen share, you can do essentially anything.
Do you do hangouts? Like, do you jump around different servers and do hangouts or anything like
Yeah,
that?
I kind of hang out in a couple. So like StepZen has one, Redwood has one. I'm in a couple for like open source, which is
Hmm.
Brian Douglas's Discord. I'm in the
Yeah.
React Podcast Discord, which is like Michael Chan, a whole group of people that hang out there. So each of them kind of has their own flavor, and some are based around projects, and some are based around companies, and some are just like a kind of decentralized group of people who like to hang out. So seeing the flexibility of how it works across all those, like it's really exciting. And I'm a very big proponent of like communities moving from Slack to Discord. I think that like there's a lot of great things for Slack in terms of like collaboration in a workplace, and I think and then across workplaces actually like with Slack Connect. But if you want to just get like a community online that's easier for people to get to and to interface with, I find Discord is just so much better for that.
Yeah. 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 It's great because people can just drop in immediately, but yeah, I mean, you don't get Um, yeah, well, they get access to all the channels. What we were doing, as you probably know, is Slack Connect, and then we had one channel for a few of the community members. But it was very hard to, split the conversations, especially with the maintainers of different libraries. So now all our maintainers are on Discord as well. We've got community libraries that they develop. So yeah, it's been a good move.
Nice. I'm just dropping a couple links here in the chat. The first Discord is for Supabase, and then the second one is for StepZen. So if anyone wants
Nice.
to hop in to either of those, and then of course supabase.com for all things Supabase, and stepzen.com for all things StepZen. And then I would be remiss not to also drop this here, our podcast interview we did, which I very much enjoyed. I
Oh
recorded
yeah.
it at like midnight because you're in Singapore. So it was luckily I'm a night owl, so it was actually like, oh, this is when I have the most energy and want to talk about tech. So it's very fun.
Okay. Nice, nice. Yeah, that was a great podcast. Actually, we're building sort of an about site, so I'll throw all these podcasts and interviews that we've done on the about site. So yeah, it would be cool.
Yeah, I've got one in the can with Ant that's going to be coming out fairly soon as well.
Oh,
So
nice.
that'll be cool. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah, great.
Mhm.
And for those in, Ant is my co-founder, so that's
Mhm.
great.
Awesome. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to say before we close out here?
No, I just yeah, if anyone wants to get involved, either contributing or just get involved building, then feel free to jump into our Twitter at Supabase, or follow our YouTube, or yeah, get on our Discord, discord.supabase.com.
Awesome. I'll drop the Twitter link as well. And then you have YouTube also. I think this is, yep, there's you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoy the build in public stuff you do.
Oh yeah, thanks. I have not had much time because of the fundraise recently, these past couple of weeks, but we're actually rejigging everything. So I'm trying to build the studio, the dashboard in public. But actually, we're rethinking how we can do it so that our products don't diverge. Like, we don't want our sort of platform product to diverge from our open source hosted product. So we're trying to think of ways that we can do this better. So hopefully on one of these live streams, I'll go through the architecture, how we're going to try to do that so that we can have our platform and our hosted version, self-hosted version working in tandem.
Wow, very interesting. I'll definitely want to check that out if I'm awake when you're doing them.
Yeah, cool.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you, everyone who hung out in the chat. And we do these usually every Friday at noon. Today was a bit of a one-off, but if you want to check us out, that would be the place to do it. And yeah, definitely recommend people check out Supabase.
Thanks for having me, Anthony.